I grew up in Hong Kong. Food and farming was a big part of my family. Cooking was a big part of my family. And what I found is the system that we used to do it is just not sustainable at all. After burning fossil fuels, livestock production is the single biggest driver of climate change. And demand is just skyrocketing. And our product is based on that demand. The choice of ground pork initially is because it's the most commonly consumed protein in the world. What Fork and Good is doing is trying to find a lower impact way of growing that same meat.
We're starting off with meat cells and we're ending up with meat cells. Same type of texture, same taste, the same nutrition. So cultured meat is meat in every sense of the word.
The issue with cultured meat is not that we don't know how to grow cells already. The problem is scaling it up and doing it cheaply. The product itself is something we've been eating forever.
If you've been following cultivated meat for a while, you'll have heard the story. What's so special about Fork and Good? Well, they're creating their own bioreactors. First I thought it was with Arc Biotech, but it seems like their technology is slightly different. They're creating a new bioreactor which should allow continuous cell harvesting. In Paul Shapiro's podcast from a couple of weeks ago, he interviews Niyati Gupta, CEO of Fork and Good, about those bioreactors. Let's take a look.
And on to batteries here.
Stay with me. There's a reason I'm talking about automotive batteries, and you'll see in a bit why this applies to the cultivated meat space.
You've got an interesting display of 12 volt, 16 volt, 48 volt.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the sign's pretty obvious here. This is what you would find in a Ford Bronco, right?
Right. This is what you find in almost all vehicles in the globe, a 12 volt system.
Yeah.
And typically they were driven with a lead acid battery. And these are
heavy.
We've known about these batteries. We've used these batteries for decades and decades and decades. There have been, technological improvements with the type of grid that we use and how we make them, as reliable and as long-lasting and as deep charging as we can. But at the end of the day, it's lead. It's very heavy. This is 23.3 kilograms, and I
so
think
about 50 pounds.
one of the big technological evolutions in this 12-volt battery was the incorporation of some tools. Because these things, they have only a limited shelf life. It is not uncommon to have to replace them, especially in cold weather. And they're so heavy, they're just miserable to get out of there. You start actually molding in handles and giving them away with the battery. It's kind of giving away tooling, right up to the point where you have to change one yourself. And you're really grateful for those who do that.
Hold on. So cars have been using 12-volt batteries since about the 1950s. And really, the main innovation in that time frame has been handles. With bioreactors, we've been using them for thousands of years. It's just a place to ferment things. We fermented alcohol for tens of thousands of years. In the 1950s and 60s is when a lot of developments hit the bioreactor. We had the world's first commercial fermenters. And then in the late 1970s, when Genentech came onto the scene, really the birth of modern biotechnology in the 70s, we had a new wave of bioreactor design. Then in the 80s, we had human insulin. And up until the 90s, bioreactors were really made for growing bacteria. But then with DNA, the culturing of cells, we've been changing a lot since then. But still, that's been in the pharma space. And now, as we apply this to food, I would suspect we're going to see a whole new wave of innovation.
Also, if you think of the structure that's required to mount this, the bracketry and the fact that it has to mount to something very substantial. And then we have to connect this to that. And so the clamping and all this stuff, there's a lot of cost, there's a lot of mass. Mass begets mass. And this is a perfect example of that. Now, when Tesla introduced the Model Y in 2021, they have a low voltage system, just like the high voltage system, and they have a 12 volt. But you can see this actually was quite a light.
No kidding, it's half the weight of...
Yeah. Now, it doesn't have near the cranking hours of this, but
Right.
it doesn't turn a starter, and it's not flipping an engine. It doesn't have that kind of duty cycle.
It just has to run all the auxiliary
That's
stuff.
exactly. And again, nice handy little handle to get it in and out. But so this
Even
was,
Tesla thought this was too heavy.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and it is heavy. I mean, try to lift it.
It's
It's significant.
So that's 25 pounds.
That's your
easy.
workout, sure. But there was kind of an evolution as Tesla came to market, and quite amazing. Within a year, that was replaced with this. So that 12-volt lead acid battery was replaced with a 16-volt lithium ion.
This is unreal. It is so light.
Oh
my gosh.
1.8 kilograms.
That is beautiful.
So mass begets mass, but in an EV, it's exceptionally important because you have to carry your mass with you. So it takes range. And in order to get range, it takes batteries. Well, batteries are heavy and they're very expensive. And so mass is one of your biggest enemies. And so the idea to get the mass out everywhere you can. And here was a perfect example of 10 kilogram, 11 kilogram reduction right off the bat. Now comes the Cybertruck, and again another technological leap here, but going to the 48 volt architecture. When we get the whole vehicle disassembled, and we've totally done all our studies on the 48 volt, I'd like to have you come back and we'll really explain that, do a deep dive into the 48 volt system, how it works and such things. But there's the battery.
Yeah, no, that's really
So
cool.
there's
So it's a little bit heavier than the lithium 12 volt, but it's 48 volts.
it's like 4 of those, So it's and I think it's like 41 volts, 42 volts or something. But that is quite the accomplishment.
Quite the weight savings.
And so you can just look at the evolution that's happened in a matter of years, a couple of years.
Right.
Where
the legacies are still back on the big heavy
we
lump
could
of
go
lead.
put a 1940s battery and it wouldn't be much different than that one over there. So quite a progression. And this in particular, when you look at the net efficiency of such a system with respect to everything, your harnesses, how many wires, how big wires, how many strands in these wires, how much do they weigh, how much do they cost? This is a huge enabler from an efficiency perspective.
Yeah. Instrument panel support beams, is that the right terminology?
Yeah, we refer to them as a cross-car beam. They go across the car from the A pillar, right in front of the driver, door to door. There is a piece of structure between those pillars. You don't see it, you don't know about it, you don't essentially care about it, but it is important. And structurally, it's giving strength to the vehicle. It is supporting the instrument panel and everything that's associated with that instrument panel. The steering wheel column is attached to it. And then any crashworthiness countermeasures, airbags and such things are incorporated into it. So it does a lot of work. Maybe kind of an unsung hero, but it is. But if we look at a traditional, and here we have the Volkswagen 94 as a representative of a traditional approach and a very good approach. I would say Volkswagen gets kudos because they did a very nice job. But if you look, John, it's a combination of tubing, they're square tubes. Look at all the welding that occurs everywhere, the transitions that occur, the bracketry that has to come in. Where does it attach to the pillars? Where does the column and such things attach? If you understand all the tolerancing required in order to have an IP fit nicely and glove boxes work
These things,
appropriately.
all the brackets got to be perfect.
This is dimensionally, this controls everything. And so the GD&T,
What's
the dimension.
GD&T?
It's the gauging, dimensioning, it's how do we control variation? How do we engineer the things so that it all works? Because there's nothing perfect, so you have to have slip planes in certain places so everything will come together. Where you come down to the tunnel, and attach to the floor. Well, what if the floor is not there by this much? How do you accommodate all that? So it is quite a challenging piece, and it's heavy. This is another example. This was actually quite efficient. This is the GMC Hummer, the electric Hummer. But you can see because of the off-road nature and the ruggedness of the vehicle, it's larger.
Still a lot of brackets
but
and
still
welding.
a lot of brackets. It's still a lot of work. It's still, quite a challenge. This is an approach to make a lightweight version. This is the Ford F-150 Lightning, and this is a cast magnesium So it's cast in one piece. I don't have all this welding. I don't have all these problems. But magnesium castings are relatively expensive.
It's an expensive
so
way to save weight.
You are paying a premium to save the weight. One of the challenges then comes in, I've got to bolt a lot of stuff to this.
And so fasteners, bad.
Brackets that come in that everything has to now attach to. The brackets have to be attached, with radios and glove boxes and AC ducts and everything. So, by the time you add all these brackets in and all the fastening and everything, of course, that's all cost and mass and labor at the end of the day. So, a valiant attempt to get mass down, but this was the approach they took, and pros and cons to that.
And no surprise, I'm sure that's not the way Tesla does it.
No surprise, when Tesla came out with the Model Y, it was a bit jaw-dropping, to be honest with you. And you look at the cross-car beam, and if you compare what was traditional to what they came up with, elegantly simple. It's a hydroformed aluminum tube, poof, and then they co-inject plastic bracketry to it. And it's like, wow, this thing is light, from a cost perspective.
I mean, I almost joke this almost looks like a shower curtain rod.
Yeah, it's been
compared to the others.
Yeah, it's been called worse. But they came up with that, and this was really a head scratcher. It's like, wow, look at how they've done this, and why didn't we think of this before, or why doesn't it work? But when you talk to some of the engineers who have been involved in designing and building cross-car beams for maybe their career, one of the first reactions was, well, it won't work. In fact, that's a quote, it won't work. I said, well, darn, we bought the car, we drove it, seemed to drive real nice. It gets a 5-star crash rating. What do you mean it won't work? Well, it doesn't meet all our requirements, because there's a lot of requirements as things from a structural perspective and a crash perspective and all the things it has to do. Well, what required doesn't work? Well, we have, vertical bending resonant frequency specifications, and that doesn't meet it. So, but it seems to ride great. Everything seems right. So what? Why do you have that requirement? Well, then you realize some of that requirement has come about because of an internal combustion engine in a V6 or inline 4 configuration. They are dynamically active. And when that crank goes around once, those engines have a couple imbalance and a second order, a couple imbalance, a third order torque, from firing, and they shake like crazy. Well, we don't want the passenger, the driver to experience that, so we have to come up with all those specifications on how to design the thing such that it's quiet and smooth and good. It's an EV.
It's an EV. You don't need all that.
It's got an electric motor. It hums like a sewing machine. You don't have all that forcing function, so it's the game changer.
So this is something that you've talked about in the past, how legacy automakers have to unlearn some things, and definitely unlearn some of the legacy specifications that they have.
That's a prime example. Well, now we come to the Cybertruck, and we get to the cross-car beam, and it's like, okay, well, again, we have a substrate here. As you can see the aluminum, but they've really taken the plastic to a new height. You see how the injected moldings here and all the but pick it up.
Yeah,
it almost
it
floats.
Looks heavier.
Yeah, it's a little heavier for sure. And from an efficiency perspective, how much weight does it have to bear, and how much weight is it versus how much things we bolt onto it and such. This isn't the most efficient design. But then, of course, you have to look at the duty cycle. In fact, I'm a truck. I'm going to be playing off-road.
Got to be beefier.
I'm going to be banging around. I can't be braking. I can't be rattling. I can't be doing these types of things. So, very interesting, again, the design, but following the same essential principle, but doing it in a way that fit their need here for the Cybertruck.
And these square holes,
yeah,
what's
good,
that about?
Good eye. We talked here about all the things that get attached to it and the need for brackets, and then we rivet the brackets on, or we bolt them on, screw them on, and weld them on, however we do it. Tesla, because they have this molding, they just have these little windows, and the parts just snap fit in. They just have tabs. It's just push it in, click, it clicks in, it
That
clicks
is so
in.
smart.
And so from an assembly perspective and labor, time, driving that out.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about bioreactors. I know a little bit. I know there's different types of bioreactors, but I'm willing to bet that, as we saw with the evolution of batteries, we need different types of batteries in EVs than internal combustion engines. With the carb racing, we need different types of carb racing for EVs than we do combustion engine vehicles. We have the same changes that are going to be happening in the bioreactor space, where we need different types of bioreactors for cell cultured meat than we do in the pharma industry. So we're going to see, hopefully, a lot of innovation, and we'll be required to innovate in order to actually get the costs down. Back to Fork and Good.
Just because you're not growing the whole animal doesn't mean that cell culture is more efficient. What I found is that when you are growing cells outside of livestock, they're taking 10 or 20 times more feed. And that means it doesn't matter how big you get, you're always going to be more expensive. And this applies also to the climate impact portion, because if you're taking about 40% of carbon emissions from animals are coming from the feedstock. So if you're 10xing or 20xing that, you now have a more carbon intensive meat. So what we were looking at was, is there a way that cells can be more efficient? And we did several things to the bio process. So we didn't use stem cells, for one. We started where feed conversion was the highest, so mammals, beef and pork, where we had the best chance of beating the feed conversion. We then didn't use scaffolds, right? So we grow these cells in 3-dimensional clusters, and we have a patent issued for that. We then applied the first principles thinking also to the manufacturing. So we're not using farmer grade, stir tank bioreactors. We're again thinking about, well, how do we get this incredibly high yield of cells in a small space and have cheap enough capex for this to make sense, for this to match the cost of conventional meat? We have done the math, and we are now at 3 or 4 calories of feedstock in for 1 calorie of meat out. So for reference, that's 4 times more efficient than a pig and 5 times more efficient than a cow. It doesn't mean we're cheaper yet, but we really are confident. Like, I now have the conviction that we will be.
But I want to ask you about these bioreactors, because you've stated now and in news articles that you don't use stir tank reactors, which is what pretty much everybody else uses. So what's agitating your media then? Like, if it's not impellers, what are you doing?
And so part of the reason we had to invent different bioreactors was not just because the existing ones were expensive, but if we did use an impeller, like, think about what I just described. 3D clusters of cells growing incredibly high yields. So you end up with a very viscous solution. Now imagine putting blades in there and then just rotating that blade really fast. You're going to destroy all of those beautiful cells that are growing. So we had to come up with a really gentle mixing technique, and I can't reveal it publicly because, we're actually in the middle of patenting it yet, but it's with a partner when we have an exclusive partnership for it. And it's a different mixing device, and then the tanks are just tanks, right? So there's nothing hugely different about like a perfusion tank that it can be off the shelf, but it's more that we've put it together in a unique way. And because we have this gentle mixing and we don't have scaffolds, it allows us to do continuous harvest, and that's kind of the key.
Right.
So continuous harvesting means instead of growing up the cells and then stopping the process and then harvesting it once in a batch, you can kind of have a tap and keep harvesting the cells while this batch keeps growing. So you can have a much smaller vessel for a lot more cells.
That's cool. So, if you look at, of course, fungi fermentation is very different from animal cell culture. But if you look at what Quorn, Quorn, is doing in the UK, they're by far the most advanced of the mycelial fermentation companies out there. And they don't have impellers in their reactors. They use air, basically air bubbles, to agitate they also run a continuous process. So it's a permanent bleed and a permanent feed, so to speak. So and so that process enables them to get down to conventional meat prices.
So we use something called airlift technology, but we do it a little bit differently. We have air that could either go outside the tubes or inside the tubes and creates mixing. We use a lot of computational fluid dynamics, a lot of fancy equations to model this out and to create just the right airflow and just the right dimensions.
In fact, I was in London in 2023. I went into KFC and I was shocked to see on the menu that a corn chicken patty was basically about the same price as a regular KFC chicken patty. It wasn't identical, but it was close enough that it appeared to me to be pretty close to price parity. And
Very
that was
very similar. Yeah.
Right. It was very, very impressive. And, these folks have a different idea from you in that they have these huge reactors. Like, I think what I've read at least is that you are planning to use 1,000 liter reactors as opposed to these gigantic ones, whereas corns are they have several 150,000 liter reactors going. But is that still your plan, to try to assemble a number of 1,000 liter reactors as opposed to having a corn style 150,000 liter tank, or what Eat Justice talked about, where they want to have like 250,000 liters going at once? Is that still the fork?
Yeah. 1,000, 10,000, but no more than that. So there's definitely economies of scale, but I think that you have to think about this a little bit like a craft brewery, right? So it's not about how big your tanks are. It's about how do you spread labor across the amount of yield? How do you spread CapEx across the amount of yield? And for us right now, it's just important to de-risk. So there's a lot of questions on scale. So the reason we're thinking about 1,000 today is Forking Good is thinking about what's the smallest facility we can build and still prove that the payback period makes sense, and then unlock this cheaper cost of capital. So it's a little bit opposite, right? Where some people are trying to do the biggest possible to prove the scale by making a lot of product, right? But we believe that as long as you have shown the customer traction, you just need to have the smallest possible facility that still gets you that payback period. And by the way, meat processing is not profitable. Their payback periods are between 10 to 13 years. So proving that you could do this in, under 3 would be a huge, really big deal in just meat processing overall.
Yeah, and for those who aren't initiated, by payback period, what we're talking about is how long does it take for you to make enough profit that you pay off the initial capital investment in this plant, or an internal rate of return. And there's different ways. I talked with Josh Tetrick earlier in this series about this, and he was looking at it not so much as an IRR or an internal rate of return as to how to pay the plant off, but how to produce enough return for the investor that even if you do have a double-digit year IRR, like you were talking about, at least the valuation of the company is high enough that the investor who funded the capital expenditures could get their return at least.
That approach makes a lot of sense because they've gone for raising a lot of money at high valuations, and so we are on the other end of the spectrum where we haven't raised a lot of money and we've been very capital efficient. And so that allows us to be able to go for this approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Forking Good has raised like 22 million to date. Is that correct?
Closer to 23.
23. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
For reference, Eat Just has raised just over 860 million to date, as of September 2023. So technology strategies are going to be slightly different so that they can, in theory, get the investment returns out of it. That's in theory. In reality, we're going to have to wait and see how this all plays out. Thanks as always for watching. We'll catch you in the next video.